My wife, Sarah, 37, and I, 36, had been married for 11 years. Over those years, we had built a life together, one that involved raising two wonderful children, our daughter, Emma, 10, and our son, Luke, 8. Despite the usual challenges, I thought we were happy. We had our ups and downs, like any couple, but nothing that ever made me believe this would happen. About 4.5 months ago, Sarah got a new job. It was a big move for her. She had always wanted to work in a more challenging environment, and this role was a significant step up in her career. I was proud of her and supported her fully, but I could tell early on that there was something different about this job. It wasn't just the work itself, it was the people she was spending time with. She made some new friends at this job. At first, I was happy for her. It's important to have a social life outside of your partner, and I wanted her to feel fulfilled. But soon, I started to notice something unsettling. The women she was spending time with were hardcore feminists. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with feminism. I'm all for equality. But these women, they weren't just advocates for gender equality. They were extreme in their views. They were what some might call SJWs, social justice warriors. The kind of people who would go off on a rant if you even so much as held the door open for them. And if you didn't, well, you were labeled as patronizing. At first, I laughed it off. I thought it was just a phase, that she would get over it. After all, we had been together for over a decade, and while we had differences, we had always worked through them. But over the last couple of months, I began to notice subtle shifts in Sarah's behavior. It started with little things, comments, arguments, things that seemed so out of character for her. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but I knew something was wrong. It felt like she was becoming someone else, someone I didn't recognize. Sarah began accusing me of things I had never even considered. She told me that men historically had oppressed women, and because I was a man, I was somehow inherently evil. I tried to reason with her, but nothing seemed to make sense. If I did something nice for her, she would twist it around, claiming that I was only doing it to make up for my inherent oppression. We'd argue, and I'd find myself pleading with her. I haven't done anything wrong, I'd say. The only thing I've ever done is love you. But those words never seemed to make a difference. Every day felt like a new argument over nothing, over things that never mattered before. The tipping point came about 5 weeks ago. One evening, she came home later than usual. She hadn't told me she'd be late, and I couldn't get a hold of her on the phone. When she finally stumbled in, she was clearly drunk and distant. I tried to engage with her, but she was cold, barely acknowledging me. The next morning, when I tried to talk to her about it, she dismissed me, telling me I was being controlling and reading too much into things. This wasn't the first time this had happened. Over the past month, it had become a regular pattern. Late nights, mysterious absences, and a complete lack of communication. It was around this time that my gut started telling me something was seriously wrong. I felt like I was losing her, but I couldn't figure out why. I tried to be patient. I tried to give her the space she needed, but the distance between us was growing, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. I knew I had to find out what was really going on. I wasn't the type to snoop. Sarah and I had always trusted each other, but something told me I needed to see for myself what was happening. One evening, after Sarah had gone to bed, I went through her phone. I didn't expect to find anything incriminating, but as I scanned through her messages, one conversation caught my eye. She had been messaging one of her new friends, and they were discussing how she was planning to ask me about an open relationship. I felt sick. The words on the screen confirmed everything I had been fearing, but hoping wasn't true. I immediately knew what I had to do. I didn't even need to read anymore. It was clear that she was emotionally checked out of our marriage, and possibly physically as well. But I couldn't confront her right then. No, I had to be smart about this. I needed proof, and I needed to be sure before I did anything. The next day, Sarah tried to bring up the topic of an open relationship during breakfast. She was acting as though this was just some casual, random thought she had. I knew this was my moment. I had been preparing for this conversation, mentally rehearsing what I would say. I had already started recording the conversation on my phone just in case. I wasn't going to let her manipulate me, deny things, or gaslight me. "Do you want to have an open relationship?" she asked nonchalantly. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't yell, I didn't break down. I just went into a mode of calm, controlled interrogation. I didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me upset. I needed answers. "What do you mean?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. She tried to look innocent, but I could see the guilt in her eyes. I pushed further, demanding the truth. "Don't treat me like an idiot. If we're going to have this conversation, you need to be honest with me. I can tell you're hiding something." She denied it at first, but it was clear she was lying. I pressed harder. "If you're lying to me right now, this conversation ends. Our marriage ends. Do you understand?" That's when it all came crashing down. She finally admitted it. 2 one-night stands with married men, both of whom had families. My heart dropped into my stomach. I tried to hold my composure, but I felt numb. Then she dropped the bombshell. I asked her about a guy at work, someone she had mentioned before. She told me she planned to sleep with him, and that it was good for her. She also told me I had no right to control her anymore. I was stunned, but I kept my cool. I asked her for her phone, and she handed it over, seemingly unaware of what I was about to do. As soon as she left to use the bathroom, I locked myself in my office and began running recovery software on her phone to retrieve any deleted messages. My suspicions were confirmed. I found everything: painful evidence of her affairs, conversations with her friends discussing how she was planning to leave me to get what she deserved. I didn't respond to her cries when she came back, banging on my office door. I didn't say a word. I just quietly packed her things. She yelled at me that I was controlling her, that I had never loved her, that I was holding her back. But nothing she said could make me feel bad anymore. The truth was out. The trust was gone. Eventually, she left to stay at her parents' house. I told her she was single now, and I would be in touch with my lawyer. I felt a strange sense of relief, but also overwhelming grief. I didn't expect what happened next. At first, I thought she might be remorseful. But no. The next time I saw her, she was talking to her friends, who were telling her how strong she was for demanding what she was entitled to. They told her that I would never go through with a divorce, that I would cave and beg her to come back. They were wrong. I was done. But then the conversations turned darker. One of her friends, who had been through a nasty divorce, told Sarah that she could easily accuse me of domestic abuse if needed. They talked about how this friend had done it before, to take everything from her ex-husband. I could hardly believe what I was hearing, but it was a wake-up call. I needed to protect myself, my kids, and my future. I installed security cameras at my house and began recording everything, every conversation, every interaction. I couldn't take any chances. It wasn't long before Sarah showed up at my parents' house, demanding to be allowed to celebrate Christmas with us. My father threatened to call the police if she didn't leave. I was in shock. This wasn't the woman I had married. The woman who had been my best friend, the mother of my children. And so, the nightmare continued. I tried to explain to the kids that mommy wasn't coming back. She didn't want to be a family anymore. I could see the heartbreak in their eyes. I wish I had waited until after Christmas to tell them, to get them into therapy first. But I couldn't help it. The pain was too much. I needed to be honest, even though it tore me apart. I was lost. The woman I had loved for so long, the person I thought I knew better than anyone, was gone. It felt like a betrayal of the deepest kind. How could she do this? How could she just walk away from everything we had built? I couldn't understand it. And I still don't. Was she mentally ill? Was she simply selfish? Or was I just another casualty of a world that was telling her she deserved more, that she could have everything she wanted without consequences? I didn't know, but I couldn't go back. There was no going back to that woman, the woman who had betrayed me and our children. My heart was broken, but my resolve was stronger than ever. After the unsettling encounter with my wife, where she'd barged into our home to argue with my dad and accuse me of all sorts of things, I knew things were only going to get worse before they got better. Since that day, she hadn't reached out to me or the kids. No texts, no calls, no gestures of reconciliation. It was clear that she had no interest in maintaining any sort of relationship, and the silence was deafening. I couldn't help but wonder if this was some sort of calculated tactic on her part, but at this point, I wasn't willing to waste energy on trying to figure her out. The truth was, she didn't care about us anymore. If she did, her actions would have reflected that. The day I had been anticipating arrived. My lawyer finally gave me the green light to proceed with serving her the restraining order. I had been waiting for this moment, but part of me still felt uneasy about the idea of escalating things. I never imagined I'd find myself in this position, having to protect myself and my children from the woman I once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. As I sat down to call her that afternoon via Zoom, I tried to remind myself that this wasn't just about me. It was about protecting my kids, preserving some semblance of sanity, and setting the stage for a clean break. My lawyer had told me that the key to getting an amicable divorce was to remain calm and non-confrontational. The stakes were high, and if I let her bait me into a fight, it would only make things harder down the road. I had to stay composed. It was hard to do, but I tried. When my wife finally appeared on the screen, I was taken aback. She looked different. Her hair was styled, makeup meticulously applied, and her clothes? Well, let's just say her outfit was designed to draw attention, especially her massive cleavage, which she made no effort to conceal. It felt like a show, as though she was trying to prove something. I hadn't seen her this done up in years. It was all so strange and unsettling, considering the gravity of what we were about to discuss. But it didn't matter. I was here for one thing only: the divorce. She opened the conversation in the most bizarre way imaginable. I don't know what I was expecting, maybe a civil greeting or some acknowledgement of our shared history, but instead, she started with something that felt almost like a weird, twisted joke. She began talking about the two types of penises. Yes, you read that right. According to her, there were those that stayed roughly the same size regardless of arousal, and those that grew or shrank depending on the situation. What in the actual hell? I just stared at her, unsure if she was trying to make a point or if she had completely lost touch with reality. I couldn't even fathom how to respond to something like that. My brain was scrambling to process the absurdity of it all, but I kept my cool. I had learned in therapy not to react emotionally to her provocations. She was trying to get a rise out of me, desperately so, but I wasn't going to play her game. So, I simply told her that I wasn't interested in discussing anything of that nature. I was here to talk about the divorce, and that was it. Her face faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered and began another round of verbal sparring. She was still trying to provoke me, baiting me into getting angry or defensive. At one point, she muttered something about how she couldn't wait for the restrictions on social gatherings to end so she could investigate this topic further, presumably referring to her bizarre obsession with male anatomy. Again, I just shut it down. I told her I wasn't interested in discussing her hobbies or anything unrelated to our separation. As I stuck to the script my lawyer had laid out for me, my wife grew visibly frustrated. She switched tactics, trying to mock me, to belittle me in any way she could. She even muttered some choice insults about me. Things like, "I'm so tired of you being a man," or "You just never understand." It was like talking to a brick wall, trying to engage in any kind of reasonable conversation. I was certain that, in her mind, this was all some sort of sick game. She believed that if she pushed enough buttons, I would cave, that I would beg her to come back or at least try to make amends. But that wasn't going to happen. She muted herself at one point, claiming she needed to go to the bathroom. I saw her phone screen flicker as she chatted with her friends in the background, probably strategizing on how to deal with me, or worse, laughing at the whole thing. When she unmuted, she came back into the conversation with more insults, including a bizarre comment about how I was the one who had infected her with an STD, specifically chlamydia. At first, I was confused, but then I remembered the moment of truth from weeks ago when I had been blindsided with the news that she had been unfaithful to me for months. What did she expect me to say? That I had been faithful the entire time? I didn't hold back. I reminded her that I had only recently found out about the affair, and unlike her, I hadn't been sleeping around. I told her that if she truly believed I was the one who had brought the infection into our relationship, she should get herself to a clinic. She just stared at me, a mix of disbelief and irritation on her face, but she didn't even attempt to respond. She simply shrugged and muttered, "Whatever, I don't believe you." At that point, I was done. The conversation was going nowhere. It was clear that her intentions weren't to find any middle ground or even resolve the divorce amicably. She wasn't interested in the kids or in moving on in a healthy way. This was all about her, and I was just the obstacle in her path. It was time for the contested divorce, and I couldn't put it off any longer. The following day, I shared the recording of our conversation with my lawyer. To say she was shocked would be an understatement. I could tell that even she was having trouble processing what my wife had said, but it confirmed what we all suspected. My wife was unhinged. The lawyer advised me to stay the course and keep documenting everything. If things got ugly, we had the evidence to back up my claims. In the meantime, I had access to my wife's phone records, and the fact that I owned her phone and the subscription allowed me to monitor her communications. It was legal to monitor my own device, and I made sure to gather as much evidence as possible for the coming legal battles. It didn't sit well with me, but in a sense, I felt like I had no choice. I had to protect myself and my children. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that my wife was still treating this like a game. A sick, twisted game. She was still trying to control the narrative, still believing that I would bend to her will. But that wasn't going to happen. I was done with her manipulation, and I was ready to fight for my freedom. My lawyer was confident that we would win the divorce, and that I would gain custody of the kids. The situation with my wife was clear. She had no interest in being a mother, and the court would recognize that. But I still couldn't shake the hurt. It didn't matter how much progress I made in the divorce proceedings or how much I put on a brave face for the kids. It still felt like my world was falling apart. I had stopped feeling sorry for myself, but the pain lingered. I had to remind myself that the pain was phantom pain, something I had to endure in order to move on and protect my family. I couldn't keep dwelling on the past. I had to look forward. The situation got more complicated when I learned something else that twisted the knife further. My wife had known about the chlamydia infection all along and had sought treatment without telling me. To make matters worse, she had been laughing about it with her new friends, acting as if it was some kind of joke. The betrayal stung even more, but at this point, I was beyond surprise. Every day, my wife proved just how far gone she was. I kept moving forward, putting together the pieces of my new life. My lawyer continued to help me navigate the divorce, and slowly but surely, the path ahead was becoming clearer. But as I started to gain some control over the situation, my wife's behavior grew even more erratic. As the days wore on, the situation with my soon-to-be ex-wife, STBXW, grew even more bizarre. She was like a ticking time bomb, unpredictable, erratic, and constantly shifting in ways I couldn't keep up with. After the Zoom call, I tried to push the pain aside, focusing on the next steps in the legal process. I couldn't afford to let her get under my skin any more than she already had. But I also couldn't help but wonder, who is she now? What had happened to the woman I once loved? Despite everything, I had to remind myself that I wasn't doing this just for me, I was doing it for my children. They were the ones who would ultimately suffer the most if this divorce dragged on. I had to protect them, even from their mother, and that thought kept me moving forward, even when I was emotionally drained. There were still moments when I woke up in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, overwhelmed with the weight of it all. But I couldn't afford to wallow in self-pity. Not when the stakes were this high. The real gut punch came when I found out the extent of her betrayal. The fact that she had been sleeping around wasn't just the tip of the iceberg. It was the entire iceberg. She had been unfaithful for months, and not just with one man, but multiple men. It was like a dagger to my chest every time I uncovered a new layer of her deception. But the part that stung the most wasn't even the affair itself. It was the fact that she had known about the chlamydia infection, had treated it, and never once told me. I remember when I first confronted her about the disease, how her face turned white, and how she tried to deflect the blame onto me. The shock of it all made my head spin. But now, knowing that she had already sought treatment, had kept it from me, and had made a joke of it with her new friends, that cut deeper than anything else. She had gone from being the woman I trusted implicitly to someone who didn't just break our vows but actively plotted against me, using me as a pawn in her twisted game. It didn't stop there. I learned from my lawyer that my wife had tried to get her hands on our assets in ways that were, frankly, underhanded. She had already been discussing the possibility of selling off her house and liquidating investments, actions that would severely affect the financial security of our children. The idea of her turning our shared home into just another cash grab made my blood boil. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that none of it was surprising. Her behavior wasn't about our marriage anymore. It was about her own selfish desires, her warped need for control and validation. She wasn't interested in the kids or in moving on in a healthy way. To her, everything was a transaction, a way to get what she wanted and move on to the next phase of her life, without a second thought for anyone else. It wasn't long before my lawyer got involved in another round of discussions, this time aiming for an amicable divorce. But when I learned that my wife showed up to the meeting with no lawyer of her own and instead brought one of her new friends, I knew this was going to be another one of her games.
She hadn't changed.
She was still trying to manipulate the situation to her advantage, assuming that everything could go her way if she just played her cards right. The meeting itself was surreal. She showed up nearly 30 minutes late, as if her time was more valuable than mine, with no real explanation. She didn't even attempt to take the process seriously. Her new friend tried to wind me up from the get-go, making snide remarks and casting insults my way. I was shocked at how blatant they were about it. They made no effort to hide their animosity, and I could see the contempt in their eyes as they laughed off every serious question my lawyer posed about the divorce settlement. The entire session felt like a joke. They were so dismissive and unprofessional that at one point, I found myself wondering if they were even aware of how ridiculous they looked. But I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me upset. My lawyer had given me very clear instructions: stay calm, stay quiet, and don't let anything they say get to me. As they tried to needle me, I kept my responses minimal, neutral, and non-confrontational. At one point, they even tried to mock my appearance, making fun of my unshaven look. It was like they were trying to break me, but I wasn't having it. I wasn't going to engage with their petty antics. The highlight of the meeting, if it could be called that, came when my wife eagerly jumped at the chance to settle the divorce quickly. She was so focused on the money she thought she was about to secure that she didn't even bother listening to the terms my lawyer was laying out. My lawyer had proposed a generous lump sum settlement of $60,000 for her share of the house and investments. It was a substantial amount, but I wasn't about to let her walk away with more than what was fair. When she saw the number, her face lit up with greed. She didn't even want to discuss the finer details of the divorce. She just wanted the money and wanted it fast. The entire situation fell off. It was clear that she was more interested in the money than in the well-being of our children or resolving anything amicably. She didn't even want to take the time to consider the full scope of the settlement. As soon as my lawyer finished outlining the terms, my wife, along with her friend, practically jumped on the opportunity to sign the papers. There was no discussion about custody or visitation, no mention of any long-term co-parenting plans, nothing. She just wanted to sign and move on with her life. My lawyer was flabbergasted at how hasty she was, but in a way, I saw it as a blessing. It meant that we could move forward, even though the whole process felt tainted by her lack of remorse or understanding of what was truly at stake. But the settlement wasn't final yet. My lawyer reminded me that we still had to go through the formalities of a court hearing and present the documents before it was official. The thought of the court hearing made me nervous, though. I had heard so many horror stories from other fathers, how the system seemed to favor mothers, how they were expected to pay alimony and child support for years, even if they weren't the primary custodians. The injustice of it all weighed heavily on me. I just wanted this to be over. My lawyer assured me that we were in a good position, but the possibility of a drawn-out battle still loomed large. The uncertainty gnawed at me. What if she changed her mind? What if she decided to contest the agreement and drag everything through the courts? I couldn't afford to wait much longer. My kids needed stability, and I needed to move on with my life. The stress was beginning to wear on me. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. I just wanted to escape the nightmare that had become my life. But I kept telling myself to push through. My children needed me. I couldn't let them see how broken I felt. So I kept going through the motions, preparing for the hearing, getting everything in order, hoping against hope that things would go smoothly. It wasn't long before things took another strange turn. One morning, I woke up to a knock on the door. A group of police officers stood outside, holding a search warrant. My stomach dropped. The last thing I expected was to have my house raided. The officers wouldn't tell me exactly what they were looking for, but they assured me that I was allowed to take the kids outside while they conducted the search. I was confused, shaken, and worried. Was this part of some revenge plot? Were they looking for evidence of something I didn't know about? I didn't think much of it at the time, but in hindsight, I realized how chaotic everything had become. My wife's behavior had grown so unpredictable that I couldn't even rule out the possibility that she had something to do with this. The officers didn't find anything, thank God, but the damage was done. I was left with more questions than answers, and the stress of it all was beginning to feel unbearable. To add insult to injury, I found out that my wife and her friends had gotten into a car accident while driving under the influence. They had been drunk, high, and reckless. My ex and her companions had crashed my car into a house at high speed. The scene was horrifying, and it was all over the news. They had been arrested on a range of charges, and one of her friends, Henrietta, the one who had been so cruel to me, was in critical condition. The rest of them were roughed up, but they were all alive. It was almost like everything had come full circle. The woman I once loved was no longer recognizable. She was a shell of her former self, surrounded by toxic influences, spiraling further into self-destruction. I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of relief in the midst of it all. Maybe this was the universe's way of finally severing the last ties between us, forcing me to face reality head-on. What I once thought was a marriage built on love had, in the end, become nothing more than a hollow facade. But the emptiness it left behind still stung. As I sat there reflecting, I felt both an overwhelming sadness and a profound sense of liberation. It was strange, almost surreal, but there was a part of me that finally accepted it. Maybe she had already left a long time ago, mentally, emotionally, if not physically. It was as if the woman I had known had been replaced by a stranger, someone who couldn't care less about the life we had built together, the family we had created, or even the love we had once shared. The divorce proceedings were only a formality at this point. I had already decided that there was no way I could continue living with someone so distant, so callous, and so manipulative. The legal team had already been in contact, and things were progressing, but the reality of it all was settling in, piece by piece. The divorce wasn't just about legalities. It was about breaking free from the emotional prison I had been living in for so long. The meeting with my lawyer and my soon-to-be ex-wife had been the last straw. She had shown up to the office late, without any lawyer of her own, claiming she didn't need one. Instead, she had brought a friend along, another woman who seemed to be as bitter and jaded as she was. The two of them had arrived, unmasked and full of bravado, ready to push my buttons and see if they could get a reaction out of me. My lawyer, however, had prepared me for this. She'd given me strict instructions: stay calm, don't engage, and only respond when absolutely necessary. I had to bite my tongue when they mocked me, when they tried to taunt me with little jabs and insults. It was clear they thought this was some sort of game, some power struggle where they could dictate the terms and I would have no choice but to comply. But I wasn't playing along anymore. When the negotiations began, I could see the glint in my wife's eyes. She still thought she could manipulate the situation, that she could somehow walk away with everything and leave me with nothing. Her behavior was predictable, even though it was absurd. She barely seemed to listen to the proposed terms, her attention more focused on her friend's snide remarks and the idea that she could finally win something. It was like watching a train wreck in slow motion, and I was standing on the sidelines, powerless to stop it. At one point, I even felt a fleeting sense of pity for her. How had we gotten here? How had this woman, whom I had loved, built a life with, and raised children with, become so warped? It wasn't even that she was a different person anymore. No, she was the same person, just far more extreme, far more selfish, and far more willing to do anything to get what she wanted. Her priorities had shifted entirely. The children, the family, the life we had shared, they no longer mattered to her. They were just obstacles in the way of whatever new life she was chasing, whatever fantasy she had spun in her head. The next few weeks passed in a blur. The process dragged on, and I was left to navigate it all on my own. But in a strange way, I began to feel more confident. I had hired a private investigator, someone who was able to gather hard evidence of my wife's infidelity. The truth about her actions, about her complete disregard for the vows she had made, was now undeniable. I had the photos, the texts, and the recordings to prove it. It was like all of the pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. It wasn't just that she had cheated, it was that she had lied about it, had deceived me, and had put me at risk without a second thought. It hurt more than I cared to admit. The emotional toll of everything had been immeasurable, and yet, here I was, standing firm, determined to take control of my life again. In one of our final meetings, she had signed away custody of the children to me, without a second glance. It was as if she was already done with them. Done with everything. She wanted the money, the freedom, and the chance to start over without any real consequences. But I wasn't going to let that happen. My focus was on my children, on making sure they had a stable, loving environment to grow up in. And if that meant fighting tooth and nail for everything we had left, then so be it. The day of the court hearing arrived. It had all led up to this moment. After months of turmoil, of back and forth legal meetings, and of my own soul searching, I was finally standing on the verge of being free. The divorce wasn't final yet. It would take another 4 to 6 months for the paperwork to go through, but it was over. The emotional battle, the personal struggle, the endless second-guessing, it was finally coming to a close. I felt a sense of exhaustion that I had never known before. I hadn't slept properly in days, possibly weeks. But there was something else, something that had been slowly building within me. Peace. The peace that came with knowing I had done everything I could. The peace that came with accepting the inevitable. The peace that came with the realization that, no matter how difficult the road had been, I was finally free from her. When the judge ruled in my favor, granting me full custody and confirming the terms of the divorce, I could hardly believe it. For a moment, I thought I might break down. After everything, after all the pain, the lies, the heartache, I might just crumble. But I didn't. Instead, I walked out of that courtroom with a sense of calm, knowing that the worst was finally behind me. Things continued to move quickly after that. My ex-wife's behavior only seemed to spiral further. In the days following the hearing, she was arrested for a DUI, caught in my car, driving drunk with her friends, crashing into a house at high speed. It was surreal. My life had become something out of a bizarre nightmare, and yet, I was still standing. My lawyer had warned me about the possibility of her retaliating, of her pulling some kind of desperate move to try and drag me down with her. But I was ready for it. I had already put the pieces of my life back together. The house was cleaned, restored to a semblance of order, and my children were safe, surrounded by the love of family and friends. My dad, my rock throughout this entire process, had rallied a group of friends and family to help clean up the mess she had left behind. They fixed everything, down to the smallest details, loose door handles, scuffed floors, even washing the ceiling. It felt almost symbolic, like they were fixing my life too, piece by piece, after everything she had broken. As I sat on the back porch, eating my mom's comfort food and watching my kids play in the yard, I finally allowed myself to relax, if only for a moment. The nightmare was over. My children were safe. My future was no longer defined by the woman I once thought I would grow old with. I had to let go of the past. I had to stop mourning what was lost because it was gone. And in its place, I could begin to rebuild. Maybe it was true that things didn't always work out the way we planned. Maybe it was true that the life I had dreamed of was now just a memory. But that didn't mean I couldn't start over. It didn't mean I couldn't find happiness again. For the first time in months, I felt the smallest glimmer of hope. I had to move forward for myself, for my children, and for the future that was still waiting for me, just on the other side of the pain. And just like that, I knew that whatever came next, I would be okay. I still couldn't believe it. The sense of disbelief hung over me like a thick fog. After everything that had happened, after all the pain, betrayal, and heartbreak, I was still left asking myself how it had all come to this. How had I gone from being in love with the woman I married to watching her spiral into a pit of destruction so deep that it had claimed not only her own life, but also the well-being of everyone around her? I had no words, no clear understanding of what had happened, only a gut-wrenching sense of helplessness, mixed with anger and confusion. I had received support from so many unexpected places in the past few days, and I truly had no idea how I could ever repay them. I had gone from feeling like I was at the lowest point in my life, contemplating suicide just a weekend ago, to suddenly feeling like I was starting to pull myself together. The transformation wasn't instant, and it didn't feel permanent, but it was a start. It was a fragile start, but it was something. My emotions were still raw, torn between a sense of relief and deep sadness. The news of what had happened to Henrietta sent a sharp pang through me. When the cops raided her house, they discovered more drugs stashed away. But that wasn't the worst part. Henrietta's boyfriend wasn't even around. No one was there to care for the kids, not even a babysitter. Just the children, alone and vulnerable. The police had no choice but to call CPS, who arrived quickly and took the children into protective custody. It was hard to imagine the horror of that moment for the kids. But what made it worse, what tore at my heart the most, was knowing that Henrietta had been living in this chaotic, dangerous environment, where her kids were neglected and left to fend for themselves. Henrietta had never been the best mother, but I hadn't known it was this bad. This revelation was enough to make my stomach turn. She had abandoned her own children. Henry, bless him, was there when it all came crashing down. With the chat logs I had provided showing Henrietta's constant neglect, her addiction, and her dangerous behavior, he went before the judge and was awarded temporary emergency custody of the kids. It wasn't easy, but the evidence was undeniable. The relief in Henry's face was overwhelming, but the fight wasn't over yet. They still had to go to court to make the custody arrangement permanent. But for now, the kids were safe. That was what mattered. Henry, the man who had been separated from his children for nearly 5 years, now had a chance to raise them. He had spent years scraping together money for legal fees, trying to fight Henrietta in court. But now, it seemed like the court had finally recognized what I had known all along. Henrietta was no longer fit to care for her kids. She had given up on them long ago. Despite all of this, Henry remained optimistic. He was overjoyed by the opportunity to raise his children, but even as I stood by his side, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was no real victory in this. I could feel my own heart heavy, knowing that Henrietta had pushed away so much, including her own family. When I learned that Henrietta had been involved in a car crash that weekend, my first thought was of the kids. I had no idea if they had been with her at the time. She had driven off the road into someone's house. It wasn't just a fender bender. The crash was bad. Henrietta and her passengers were all badly banged up. The car had been inoperable, the damage severe. As usual, alcohol and drugs were involved. This wasn't just an accident. It was a consequence of her reckless, self-destructive behavior. The investigation into the crash led to searches of her residence and the homes of her family members. When I received a call from Henrietta's parents on Sunday, it was clear that they, too, were finally waking up to the horror of what their daughter had become. They had visited her in jail on Saturday, and the truth had hit them hard. They could no longer deny what they had been unwilling to see before. Henrietta had been lying to them about everything. The version of the story she had fed them, the one where she claimed she was staying with me and trying to work things out, was nothing but a fabrication. They had no idea how bad things had truly gotten. Her parents came to my house on Sunday to talk. They were devastated. They hadn't known the extent of Henrietta's lies. They didn't understand that she had been using drugs, partying, and cheating on me for so long. They thought she had made a mistake, but now they saw that it was a long-standing pattern of self-destructive behavior. The revelation hit them like a freight train. On Monday, Henrietta's mother called me, asking me to post bail for Henrietta. The bail was set at $15,000. After consulting with my lawyer, it was clear that there was no way I should get involved in this. Henrietta's parents had already said no. My lawyer explained that, per the agreement we'd made, any bail paid would be subtracted from the final settlement. But even that didn't guarantee her compliance. Henrietta would have to show up to her court hearings if I were to post her bail. but she had already broken enough promises, so I was not willing to risk it. Henrietta signed the paperwork, agreeing to be released on Monday afternoon. Her parents, who had already had enough, set strict terms for her if she wanted to stay with them. They demanded that she stop using drugs, commit to rehab, and follow their rules. But when they told her this, she refused to comply. She left their house on Tuesday and disappeared into the chaos of her new friends, the same people who had been enabling her addiction. When she failed to show up to the hearing, I was left with no choice. The judge had everything they needed: the chat logs, the abandonment of her children, and the destruction of her life, and the custody hearing went in my favor. In just 30 minutes, I had full custody of our children. The settlement had been finalized. It wasn't a victory, it was the final piece of a broken life, the end of a chapter that I had once hoped would be a beautiful story. Even now, I couldn't believe how quickly everything had changed. One day, I was in despair, watching the woman I loved unravel before my eyes, and the next, I was standing in a courtroom with my children's future in my hands. But it didn't feel like a victory. No part of me felt victorious. No one wins in a situation like this. My marriage had crumbled.
My family had shattered.
My children had lost their mother. I had lost my wife, my best friend. And Henrietta, the woman I once loved, had lost everything.
There was no coming back from this.
Not for her. Not for us. That night, I lay in bed, struggling to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the weight of it all would crush me. The nightmare of our marriage, the pain of losing her, the cruelty of everything she had done, it all haunted me. There was no solace, no escape. Every night was the same. Wake up, sweat-drenched and trembling, heart pounding in my chest. On Wednesday, I received a call from the hospital. Henrietta had been admitted. She had been beaten badly. Her jaw was broken, her teeth missing. She needed to stay under observation for several days. I learned that some of her new friends had attacked her. They had heard about the chat logs from Henry, the logs that had exposed Henrietta's confession of everything, her lies, her abandonment, her betrayal. They thought she had given the information to Henry, and so they had punished her for it. The irony, the cruelty of it, made my stomach churn. I couldn't help but feel a strange detachment when I heard the news. I had been her emergency contact for so long, and even though I knew she was still on my insurance, the reality of her situation was too much. I had given her so many chances, so many opportunities to change, but she had chosen this path. She had made this bed. I went to the hospital with her parents. When I saw her lying there, a shell of the woman I had once known, a part of me felt sorrow. But another part of me, the part that had suffered at her hands for so long, felt nothing. It was just numbness. She barely looked at me, hardly seemed to register my presence. There was no real emotion in her eyes, just a vague sense of frustration. It wasn't remorse, and it wasn't even real regret. She asked me, in a quiet voice, if she could move back in. Without hesitation, I told her no. There was no way I was going to let her back into my life. Her mother wouldn't give her a penny unless she stayed clean. And even then, there was a limit to what could be forgiven. She had broken everything: our family, her children's trust, herself. In the days that followed, Henrietta tried to plead for a second chance, but there was nothing left for her. She had ruined everything. She had destroyed every ounce of goodwill, every chance at redemption. I refused to let her back in, not after everything she had done. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but it was necessary. There was no place for her in my life anymore. I made the decision to go no contact.
Completely.
I had to protect myself, my children, and my sanity. She had chosen her path, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. Still, even as I went through the motions of rebuilding my life, the pain lingered. Every time I looked at the kids, I saw their trauma. I saw how much they had lost. And I knew that no matter how hard I tried, they would always carry that hurt with them. Yet there were moments of hope. Moments where we laughed. Moments where we began to find joy in simple things. The kids and I spent a weekend with my father at his cabin, skiing and playing games. It was the first time in months that I felt truly at peace, surrounded by people who loved me and cared for the children. Even though the weight of the past still loomed, I could feel the first flickers of hope. I also heard from one of Henrietta's old friends, the one who had been critically injured. She woke up in the hospital, but her condition was dire. She had been in terrible shape and, sadly, no one had visited her. Her family had refused to see her, leaving her isolated and alone in her suffering. I was torn. I knew that Henrietta's friends had hurt her, but I couldn't just ignore the suffering of one of them. Despite everything, I reached out to the nurse caring for her. I couldn't offer much, but I felt a responsibility to help. The friend had told me everything I needed to know about Henrietta's descent into addiction. The drugs, the prostitution, the people who had exploited her. She had sold herself just to get another hit. And now, she was nothing more than a shadow of the person I once loved. The news didn't help. Henrietta was in jail, facing serious charges: drug possession, trafficking, child abuse, prostitution, theft, and more. It wasn't just a bad situation. It was a catastrophe. Her life was in free fall, and there was nothing I could do to save her. The worst part was knowing that she had done this to herself. She had chosen this path. I received another call that weekend, this time with news that I never could have prepared for. Henrietta had attempted to take her own life. I had been prepared for it, but it didn't make it any easier. Her father had been the one to find her in time, and they had rushed her to the hospital. She was saved, but the damage had been done. And now, she was being committed to rehab, forced into treatment. Her father had become her legal guardian, ensuring she couldn't escape the treatment. Despite it all, a part of me still felt a flicker of empathy for her. But that didn't change the fact that she had ruined everything. I couldn't forgive her, not yet. Maybe not ever. The months ahead would be hard, filled with therapy for the kids, legal battles, and the constant weight of knowing that I had lost everything. Yet through it all, I had to stay strong for the kids, for me. They needed me. And for once, I needed to be the person who didn't give up. I had a new life to build, one without Henrietta. The future was uncertain, but I would be okay. We would be okay. Thank you to everyone who supported me through this nightmare. Your advice, kindness, and understanding meant everything. You'll never know how much it helped. And with that, I think it's time for me to move on. Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit notification bell to stay updated.